country's business leaders aren't satisfied with the way the government has handled some of the biggest challenges facing the country right now. From the electricity crisis to grey listing to crime, to name but a few. Now, to talk about this, I'm joined in studio by Professor Bonang Mohale, who is the president of Business Unity South Africa. On the line, I have the CEO of the Black Business Council, and that's Mr. Khangi Matabane. And hopefully, very shortly, we will be joined also by Mr. Alan Mugogi, the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SACCI. Good evening, gentlemen, to both of you, and thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Vuyo, and good evening, Brana Mohale.
Well, let's start with the grey listing. I mean, the president writing in his newsletter this morning, Professor Mohale, saying, hey, it's not that bad, man. The decision of the Financial Action Task Force to add us to this a grey list, it's concerning, yes, but it's not that dire.
So let me first acknowledge my leader, Ntate Khangi Matabane. Number two, to say the condition of truth is to let suffering speak. If you are the president, it's easy for you to say it's not bad. But what concerns us as organized business is the fact that it's a litany of unfulfilled promises, of lack of service delivery, of the 734 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. On the one hand, you've got high unemployment rate, and then you've got these ordinarily not being fully appointed. SABC is the latest one. That is taking the president to court. The ESCOM board stood for 18 months without a fully functioning board, 18 months above its 3-year mandate. Only 5 of them remained. They couldn't even make a quorum, but we let them go on. Imagine by how much would have made a dent in unemployment if every single solitary one of the 734 state-owned enterprises, state-owned companies were at least treated with a heightened sense of urgency. But the NDP 2030, we had 30 years, our own plan, to look at the 11 challenges and the 9 things that we needed to do. Every expert tells you today that with only 7 years left, we are unlikely to fulfill any of these. Therefore, for me, the Financial Action Task Force is only part one of many things. Kusile, Midupi, we should have finished in 2013. 10 years later, we're not even getting half the generation capacity. Even the new multi-product pipeline between Durban and Gauteng, where probably 12 million car park is located, 35% of the economic activity is at. It was initially budgeted at 7.2 billion. It was delivered at 20 billion at double the time.
Mr. Matabane, I mean, later on in the day, after having read the president's weekly letter in the morning, I had the Minister of Finance saying pretty much the same thing, that look, we're compliant. It's just that the Financial Action Task Force doesn't, have a pass mark. It's 100% or nothing. And over the past few years, we've been trying everything in our power to be compliant. And in about 18 months, we should be compliant.
Good evening, Vuyo and the viewers, and Dr. Mohale and Alan. The challenge, I think, is that the country is in on a speaking mode. We talk a lot. So even when the president or the minister says we will be out of this by in 12 months or in 24 months or 36 months, the issue is that because there's a trust deficit in the country, no one is going to believe what they are saying. And then that trust deficit is caused by a lot of talk and no action. Maybe going back to what Dr. Mohale spoke about on NDP 2030, I can't remember when last did I hear the president or any other minister talking about that, because in the NDP 2030, for example, we were supposed to, if we want to deal with the unemployment, we're supposed to create 11 million jobs by 2030, and 90% of them are supposed to come from small business. But when you look at the actions taken, including the budget that was just delivered last week, there is no focus on creating jobs and small businesses. So one can ask, what is our problem statement? Because I would have thought our problem statement is job creation, which talk to unemployment and then growing the economy. So everything that we're supposed to be doing as a country, we're supposed to be saying, how is this growing the economy? How is this creating jobs? So we cannot have a country where 70%, we've got 70% youth unemployment. And I'm sure with the matric result that came last year, the figure has gone up. And that is unsustainable from a democracy point of view. So we have to ask ourselves questions to say, are we doing what we're supposed to do to also build confidence? We've got people who just walk into a mine and mine. We've got illegal miners, we've got the construction mafias. Why can't we just get a special force to deal with these people? Because once you deal with those type of people, you're going to increase the confidence in the country. So we need to deal with the trust deficit that we have, but it's caused by inaction and too much talk. So we need to stop talking and implement as much as we can.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, last week, you know, if one looks at listen to what the Chief Justice had to say in his report on Friday about the functioning of our court system, he laments the fact that some of the things that they have, you know, discussed and put proposals on, these proposals are sitting with the executive and they are not being acted on. And in his newsletter today, Mr. Mukoki, the president talks about how they're going to tighten up on investigations and prosecution. And if one goes back to the crime statistics that were released a couple of weeks ago, it was the minister and the president who was the first to admit that we are losing the war on crime. And I'm raising all these things on the back of what Mr. Matabane has just said about the fact that these things are spoken about, promises are being made, dates are set or deadlines, but very little ever happens.
Well, good evening, Dr. Mohale and Matabane and yourself, Vuyo. I think that that's quite correct, and I think that we've reached a stage where we need to accept certain realities. And one of those realities, of course, is that the problem will not necessarily change given then if we throw a number of definitions at it. In other words, all of us know there is a very serious problem, and the likelihood of achieving success with the current architecture and infrastructure in terms of people and systems is not necessarily working for us. And I think that we need to be honest and say, we know that people are working hard. I don't think that you'll find generally many people, even those who are sitting in cabinet or the president, where you can actually accuse them of not working, of not trying to put in an effort. The thing that we're not dealing with as South Africans is that we're not actually dealing with the real issue, which is that we don't necessarily have the ability to solve the kinds of problems that we actually have today. So we keep blaming, criticizing, cajoling people, and almost like we're trying to force them into performance. If you've worked in business as an executive in any other environment, and one of the things that you get to be taught early on is that do not put people who are weak in positions, because you are going to strain and stress the organization. In other words, you are going to stress the individual that you've given the task to, because they don't actually have the ability to do it. You are also going to stress the organization in general, and the person that person reports to also takes that strain. So you're not doing anyone a favor. So if the job that you have is a 10 job and you continuously put a person who's a 5 in a 10 job, you are not actually going to get the results. So one of the things as South Africans that we do need to accept and acknowledge is that the problems have become so complex, and they're actually running away from us purely because we're not resourcing at a human resources point of view correctly. In other words, we don't necessarily think where we are now that politicians, by their very nature, due to no fault of their own, given the background of South Africa, lack of skills, lack of management talent, development and training, that they themselves would be people, if they were honest, who are equal to the task that we actually face today. So 20 years from now, we will continue to complain about the same problems. And we've made this very point very clearly. We need to have a meritorious system. We need to look at how we appoint people into positions. And we need to deal with that problem very decisively, very early, in a way that is actually permanent. We can sit here 20 years from now, as I said earlier on, we'll be complaining about exactly the same thing because we expect that someone who does not have a skill, someone who does not have a level of experience is actually going to show up and fix the logistics, or is going to show up and fix the crime, safety and security problem that we have. It's not actually going to work. So we need to be able to say, you are not necessarily going to get someone who plays in a D division of a high school soccer team suddenly wanting to play for Orlando Pirates, or Vuyo for the wrong example, but it's not gonna work. So you need to be able to say, I'm going to find someone who is equal to the task, who can do that. And we're avoiding dealing with this issue for a reason that I'm not so sure myself why it is so. Maybe we're scared to upset people. The level of development and training and executive training that is taking place either in cabinet or high levels of senior civil service is not actually adequate, not for the task that we have at hand at this particular point in time.
But we don't have, Professor Mohale, the option of throwing our hands up in the air, curling our lips and saying, there's nothing we can do.
You're absolutely correct. Maybe if I can give two more examples. The electricity crisis is a case in point. This is an issue that started in February of 2008. 15 years later, we are unable to solve this problem. Now, how believable are we if we say we are going to stop load shedding in a year, when everybody in a room from NECOM to this cabinet have been there in the first instance when it started? In 15 years, we haven't been able to, and yet we knew what needed to be done. Secondly, the reason why we put the blame on the lap of the president, it's because it is the sole prerogative of the president, not of his party, not of the top six, to appoint his cabinet. He promised us that he will have a smaller cabinet, that he is coming up on a ticket of rooting out and defeating state capture, which took root in 2007 on the way to Polokwane, manifested in 2009. Today, as we speak, 20 out of the 30 thieves that he found in that cabinet, he's decided to reappoint them when it was his sole prerogative. As we speak, some of them are promoted to be chairpersons of parliamentary portfolio committees. These are the people that have been named in the Zondo Commission, which he inherited from his predecessor, that needed to be pulled, cajoled, orchestrated to create this commission of inquiry. And it took 4 years at a cost of R1 billion. The first volume out of the 6 volumes is 787 pages. All those people are called out by name. Why are they not in jail? The Financial Action Task Force told us in 2019, verbally, in a meeting that we had with them. They produced a report in October of 2021. In 4 years, we belatedly, in the last 6 months, passed and enacted 2 pieces of legislation. We're saying there's still 15 that is outstanding. In fact, 8 critical ones to measure both the effectiveness and the efficiency of the measures that we have put in place. It's like saying, you know what, actually we're not too bad, because this is 20% that is outstanding. Six Sigma teaches us in leadership that even 98% is not good enough, because if it was good enough, we are accepting that out of 100 babies that are born at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, 2 of them are going to slip from the hands of those doctors, head first plunge to their death. We are accepting that at Tambo International Airport, 2 out of every 100 planes that land there a day every every day. They are going to overshoot the runway with a minimum of 377 passengers on board, and they'll probably perish. How can 98% be good enough? It's because we have accepted that 30% is an acceptable pass mark in our education system, which is the only means in which the majority of people, 30 million South Africans that are living below the poverty datum line, less than $1.90 US per day, can really transcend social classes. Now we condemn them to another 30 years of absolute self-perpetuating vicious cycle of abject poverty.
Now, on SONA, well, I mean, we all heard this during his address, but also, I mean, he devoted quite a number of pages on Eskom, what is being done, where the problems are, and so on. And interestingly, I mean, outgoing Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter's answering affidavit this past weekend, which was in response to a court case, it was an answering affidavit in response to a court case launched by the UDM and others. Andre de Ruyter says the bulk of the country's load shedding problems are beyond Eskom's scope. He continues to say that over the past 25 years, the main drivers that have led to the power crisis were outside of Eskom's control. I don't know what you make of this, Mr. Matabane.
Yes, I think in our view as the BBC, we need to let the past be the past. De Ruyter dismally failed at Eskom, so I don't think there's any advice that he can give to anyone. He had 3 years there, he had the most support that all the other previous CEOs never had, and he has failed. The issues that he's raising about crime and others, I think those ones need to be given to the law enforcement agencies to deal with them. Our role as South Africans should be to focus all our energies in solving Eskom. Eskom is solvable. I think the new board, which was going to have a performance review with De Ruyter when he resigned, it's a very solid board, and I think he ran away from being reviewed because he's a crybaby who wants attention. So we shouldn't focus on him. Let's focus on making sure that the current Eskom performs to its optimal levels, so that we can stop load shedding. Eskom at the moment is performing at what we call energy availability factor of 53%. He found it performing at around 60-something%. So we need to move it from 53% to 70% so that we can stop load shedding, and that is doable. Hence, we were one of the people who called for the state of disaster. But the state of disaster with the limitations so that people don't abuse it and start stealing state funds. But we are saying, if we then say, let's make sure that we get all the maintenance done properly, done by engineers, done by the original equipment manufacturers, we give that time, we make sure that all the equipment that needs to be bought, they are bought. We bring all the skills that need to be brought in there. We will be able to solve the Eskom issues within the next 24 months. But again, we don't think putting another bureaucracy in the name of a minister of electricity is going to help us, because already we've got 2 ministers. Now we're adding another layer of a minister who's going to basically add bureaucracy. The people at Eskom now have to consult another layer of a minister. I don't think that will solve the problem. But if all of us, we leave De Ruyter out of this and focus all our energies on solving Eskom, load shedding will be a thing of the past very soon.
Let's just say we do that. We focus on, solving the problems of Eskom and forget about Andre de Ruyter, Mr. Mkoki, as Mr. Matabane is saying. What do we have a chance of succeeding if, as Mr. de Ruyter is alleging, there continues to be interference? There are people who are busy wanting to help themselves, even in this new dawn. If the Sunday Times front page story is anything to go by, you've had managers overruling engineers, crippling the system even further. Do we then have a chance of succeeding?
Well, we as SACCI, of course, we avoid generally commenting on individual arrivals and departures. Individuals, that's a separate issue altogether. We can't vouch for an individual, whether they'll be good or bad. Our issue has always been the system and the system challenge in terms of how the government itself, from its own template, chooses to articulate issues of how you recruit, how you select, how you retain those people that you consider to be the people who are key in performance. Of course, if there are allegations ought to be pursued in the ordinary course of business because they are related to things to do with crime, etc., etc. But the performance issues also need to be dealt with, and in particular, we need to handle the issue around governance. We as SACCI have been very consistent in asking of cabinet itself, whether the cabinet itself does have the level and the requisite level of skills, competencies, and experiences to even know how to select a board, and therefore to even know how to select a CEO and how to do the performance management. So when people overreach, in other words, you give yourself a task that is much more higher than your own skill set, the likelihood of you making a mistake is always going to be very high. So it is that system that we need to look at in terms of whether it's competent, its tone, its pace, who are the people who are actually engaged in making sure when we sit down and we say we're actually going to choose the board, what criteria are we actually following? And I'll give you an example, and we talk about this in senior executive level conversations all the time. If you run an organization, for instance, that uses IQ as one of the key criteria, and there's this thing that is called the floor effect. The variance between people in an organization like that on IQ is actually going to be very small. So it's going to be a very narrow variation. And the people who are high performers are not necessarily going to come from IQ, but they may well come from the level of emotional intelligence across all the 4 levels of self-awareness, self-management, because these two, they give you self-mastery, empathy, and social skills. So now if you want to bring someone into an organization of that particular nature, which by its very nature is an ambidextrous organization that is very complex, that also happens to have wicked problems, you are not going to be able to succeed if you only bring a person by measuring that person only on IQ, but you don't know whether they've got the social skills, you don't know whether they have these elements of self-awareness, self-management, and empathy, because this is the same individual who ought to be able to go and deal with the unions at the level of the union leadership to understand very truly what the issues are that are actually facing the employees. I'm making that as an example in that it is never particularly clear to us when we look at government, whether it's a cabinet committee, whether it's a minister, what is this process that you are following when it comes to appointing people to be on boards and when it comes to appointing people, and what's driving your thinking and your rationale around that. So a number of these mistakes tend to happen at that particular level. Then you hear there's too much interference. Then you hear a minister is getting involved in operations. You hear the boards themselves are getting involved in operations. And then you end up having a mess of a situation. But if we rebase, we go back, we take a step back and we say, this is the way that is very clear in which we want to do governance. This is the way which is going to be very clear that we want to do selection, recruitment, and retention, and performance management, and all the elements that go with that. And this is how we're going to articulate the issues of culture and values, because I will tell you now, every time you don't look after culture and values in any organization, you're actually asking for trouble. I can sit down here. I actually don't know what the values are at Eskom and what is the culture at Eskom, but you see so many things that are happening all the time, and we don't even understand whether this one minister is going to have the same interpretation as the next minister. You have 2 ministers disagreeing on exactly the same thing. That is a reflection of a lot of the dissonance that arises because there is no template on which we're actually operating. So the problems will continue to happen, even if we sit down now. This board that is there that Mr. Matabane says is very good, they will tap them out in another 2 years because there's a problem. They'll bring another CEO. And every time we'll continue to go back because we're not actually dealing with the real issue. And that issue, as I said, it starts at the top. Is cabinet itself adequate to be able to deal with these particular issues? Do they have the level of experience, or can they rely on the level of expertise that they need to be able to do to hire and appoint board members? And therefore, when you then have the board members, what is the governance structure that says CEOs look after operations, boards, they do supervision, and they look after the things and the components that are very relevant to what they do?
Well, we've been waiting for a cabinet reshuffle for quite a while, and we know for a fact that once that gets done eventually, it will be a function of, the politics of the day. He's going to look at his NEC. He's going to look at the ministers he already has. Remember, he's just survived what was a big battle, at Nasrec. So he needs to make sure that he's got the right people next to him. And the right people may not necessarily be the right people to occupy the positions that he's going to give them. That is the fact, and that's what's going to happen.
In fact, I think we are where we are precisely because of cadre deployment. Because we are not palliating, highlighting, and celebrating merit, but rewarding loyalty. We are exactly where we are now precisely because we don't have a heightened sense of agency. We're busy fiddling while Rome is burning. Everything that could possibly go wrong about this country has indeed gone wrong. And yet we're acting as if more is noch a dag. You talk about the State of the Nation address. The president spoke about 8 themes. If I talk about only 3 actions that he promised South Africans, one was the declaration of the national state of disaster. I mean, this is extraordinary means that you are taking. From then up until now, nothing has been done to put this into place. Number 2, we spoke about the Minister of Electricity. I agree with Ntate Khanki Matabane to say, but that's not our problem. But that's what you promised. It's almost 3 weeks later, there is no Minister of Electricity. But what we did hear from the Minister of Finance in the budget speech is that we don't have a budget for this. It shows that there is not only a disjuncture, but people are working at cross purposes. Because a budget in business, it's simply a financial language as to how to execute on the strategy. Your boss tells you what the strategy is, you go and find the money. It's not your job to tell your boss that I don't have the money. Lastly, it's about fixing the more than 734 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. But if you look at the effect of stage 6 load shedding, it has been devastating to the economy in general, to you and I, because the cost at stage 6 is 6 billion a day, 4 to 6 billion a day. Between stages is 500 million. In fact, the Minister of Energy, together with NERSA, are measuring the cost of unserved electricity. When you look at that number, it says just in 2022, we had 6,400 kilowatt hours of unserved electricity. At 85 rand per kilowatt, the loss to the economy is 560 billion. So if you are a big company like Netcare, your profits are reduced by 530 million rand because of what you have spent just on the cost of diesel. They don't tell us how much they've had to put in as capital outlay in buying these generators. But if you are a small butcher and you are a small bakery, first, you don't have the money to buy a Cummins 43 kilowatt generator with 125 liters at 20 rand per liter of diesel. So, in fact, if you were just to spend your money on diesel, the cost is 8.5 times the cost per hour of electricity. Therefore, it simply pushes you into absolute bankruptcy. Ntate Matabane, when he started, he said, to address the issue of the stubbornly high levels of unemployment, we are looking at small and medium enterprises where jobs are created in large numbers. But in fact, in COVID and now during load shedding, the businesses that we are killing in great numbers, it's small and medium enterprises.
Now, here's something that the president said in his State of the Nation address. And I want to end here because so that we can begin to talk about the role of business on the back, of course, of comments that have been made recently that business is not really coming to the party, and so on and so forth. But take a listen to what the president had to say in his State of the Nation address about what's working and the role that business has actually been playing in some of the successes, he says, we've been able to see.